Hello, everyone. Today, Team Ruby will shine a light on the disruption that the war in Ukraine brought to the world's grain supply chain. The Russian Ukrainian War, which erupted February 24th, 2022, has its roots in long standing geopolitical tension and territorial disputes. Ukraine gained its independence from the crumbling Soviet Union in 1991, as did 15 other Soviet satellite nations that year. Vladimir Putin, a former Soviet leader and the leader of the Russian Federation since 1999, called the fall of the Soviet Union the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the century. Putin and other Russian leaders have long sought to reverse the effects of the disbanding of the Soviet Union by regaining solidarity and control over the former Soviet member states. One of the major factors leading to the war between Russia and Ukraine was Ukraine's increasing alignment with Western nations, especially its interest in joining the European Union and NATO. This shift was seen as a direct challenge by Russia to its influence in the region. Russia, under President Vladimir Putin, has long viewed Ukraine as part of its sphere of influence and sought to prevent its westward drift. The crisis began in earnest in Ukraine when Russia amassed over 190,000 troops along Ukraine's borders with Russia and Belarus in late 2021, signaling an impending invasion. On the morning of February 24th, 2022, Russian forces launched a full-scale military invasion of Ukraine. As Russian soldiers flooded into Ukraine from the north, east, and south, their goal was to quickly capture the Ukrainian capital of Kiev and set up a puppet government to control the country. This invasion was justified by Russia as a defensive action to protect the Russian speaking minority in Ukraine and to prevent Ukraine from joining NATO, which Russia said was a direct threat to its security. The capital city of Kiev did not fall quickly as the Russian leadership had hoped. Now, in its fourth year, the war has caused widespread destruction in Ukraine, with approximately 10 million Ukrainians being displaced from their homes. Over 12,500 Ukrainian civilians have been killed. Russian military casualties, soldiers who are reported as killed, wounded, captured, or missing, is estimated to be near 800,000, with Ukrainian losses being less only because they have fewer soldiers active in the conflict. One of the major global consequences of the war has been its impact on the global grain supply chain. Ukraine, known as the breadbasket of Europe, is one of the world's largest producers and exporters of wheat, corn, and barley, with large expanses of fertile farmland. This grain is typically exported out of Ukraine through the Black Sea and then to the Mediterranean Sea. The war severely disrupted Ukraine's ability to produce and export these vital crops, causing a ripple effect across the world. Early in 2022, the Russian Navy stationed its ships in the Black Sea to blockade important Ukrainian ports and cripple the grain supply chain. On land, Russian troops captured and destroyed grain silos and even set fire to Ukrainian fields of grain. The regular bombing of key Ukrainian ports on the Black Sea caused infrastructure damage and a threat to port workers' lives that made it very difficult to continue exporting from those locations. These conditions made it nearly impossible to ship grain to international markets and brought economic hardship to Ukraine. This also caused grain prices to skyrocket, leading to food insecurity in many parts of the world, particularly in regions heavily dependent on Ukrainian grain, such as the Middle East, North Africa, and parts of Asia. Countries like Egypt and Turkey, which are major importers of Ukrainian wheat, experienced significant increases in food prices, causing economic strain and rising social tensions. Moreover, the war led to disruptions in logistics and transport routes, making it difficult for countries to find alternative grain sources. Major grain producers such as the US, Canada, and Argentina struggled to fill the gap left by Ukraine's reduced supply. In response to these challenges, Ukraine implemented several strategies to mitigate the impact of the war on its grain supply chain. One of the primary efforts was first to seek alternative transport routes for its grain exports. Since the ports of Ukraine were blocked by Russian ships, Ukraine turned to overland transport via neighboring countries, such as Poland and Romania. These routes use rail and road networks to move grain to European ports for re export. Unfortunately, these routes were more time consuming and costly compared to traditional maritime shipping methods. In addition, Ukraine tried transporting its grain overland to the neighboring nations of Romania and Bulgaria, where grain could be shipped from their ports. These land routes were targeted by Russian bombs and quickly abandoned. In addition to land routes, Ukraine negotiated with Russian leadership to create an open shipping route through the Black Sea. The urgent need for Ukrainian grain to feed multiple nations in Africa and the Middle East, combined with political pressure from multiple countries, led to a successful compromise. In collaboration with the United Nations and Turkey, Ukraine and Russia signed the Black Sea Grain Initiative on July 22, 2022, 5 months after the war started. Ukraine was guaranteed a safe grain corridor, which allowed limited grain shipments through the Black Sea, alleviating some of the pressure. This allowed for the safe travel of international shipping vessels moving to and from Ukrainian ports for a limited agreed upon amount of time. While this agreement helped, it did not fully restore the export capacity that existed prior to the war. The Grain Corridor Agreement also expired every 6 to 8 months and required renegotiation by both nations. These negotiations began to collapse in 2023. Eventually, Ukraine was able to regain control of its Black Sea ports through its own military actions. Beginning in late 2022, Ukraine began to use naval drones to target Russian warships. Without a navy of its own, Ukraine successfully developed and deployed unmanned surface vessels, which are first person view maritime drones that are sent on kamikaze missions to attack military ships. This drone weapon proved to be pivotal in the war and led to as many as 28 Russian vessels being destroyed. The threat of drone attack, both in the air and in the water, ultimately led Russia to withdrawing their fleet to safer waters adjacent to their own Black Sea ports. Currently, the battle to control Ukraine's grain ports continues. Ukraine still maintains their safe passage for grain vessels by use of drone warfare. However, Russia continues to bomb Ukrainian ports, with attacks as recently as March 2025. A ceasefire in and around the Black Sea is a current bargaining chip being used to seek peace between Russia and Ukraine. The impact of the Russian Ukrainian war has had a far reaching effect on the global grain supply chain. Countries are now exploring new trade routes, diversifying suppliers, and investing in alternative sources of grain. For example, the European Union has worked to facilitate the continued flow of Ukrainian grain through its land based solidarity lanes, while countries like Argentina and India are being sought as new grain suppliers. At the same time, Russia has used its own grain exports as a tool for soft power, offering cheaper wheat to countries in Africa and Asia in exchange for political influence. Russia's own grain exports have risen to partially fill the gap left by Ukraine's reduced output, which reinforces Russia's strategic position in global grain markets. However, the long term stability of the global grain supply chain remains uncertain, as geopolitical tensions, fluctuating market dynamics, and environmental challenges continue to threaten global food security. Despite the difficulties of war, Ukraine is focused on long term resilience and sustainability in its agricultural sector. The Ukrainian government has been working with international organizations to improve infrastructure, particularly by enhancing rail and road networks to ensure more efficient transportation despite the ongoing conflict. This includes efforts to upgrade storage facilities and reduce bottlenecks in supply chains. Ukraine has also focused on modernizing its agricultural practices, leveraging technology to optimize production and reduce reliance on traditional methods that are vulnerable to disruption. Despite the severe damage to its agricultural areas, Ukraine continues to work toward rebuilding its capacity to produce and export grain, with plans to improve production efficiency and find alternative methods of export. Reflecting on the situation in Ukraine, one can see that the global grain supply disruption caused by the Russian Ukrainian war can be linked to the bullwhip effect. which is a phenomenon where small fluctuations in demand or supply at the consumer level leads to larger fluctuations in supply chain orders as they move upstream. Here's how the bullwhip effect has played out in the context of Ukraine's grain supply. Initial disruption in supply. The war caused significant disruptions in Ukraine's grain production and exports, with key areas of agricultural land under occupation and blockades preventing grain exports. The immediate supply of grains to global markets was significantly reduced. Demand spike. As countries that rely heavily on Ukrainian grain, such as Egypt, Lebanon, and other Middle Eastern and African nations, began to experience shortages, demand for alternative grain sources skyrocketed. This led to a surge in demand for wheat, corn, and other grains from other suppliers like the US, Canada, and Argentina. Amplified orders upstream. In response to the increased demand, downstream suppliers like grain wholesalers and processors placed larger orders with their suppliers, not anticipating the full extent of the shortage. The pressure for more grain at the retail level created larger and more frequent orders upstream in the supply chain. Excessive inventory and price volatility. As wholesalers and traders attempted to stockpile in anticipation of further disruptions, inventory levels fluctuated significantly. Grain suppliers, seeing the increased demand, might have also overordered from farmers and producers in other regions, causing grain prices to spike. Delayed feedback loop. The supply chain, which depends on precise forecasting and communication, experienced delays in feedback as to how much grain it actually needed. The imbalance between supply and demand in the early stages of the disruption led to exaggerated swings in order quantities, as suppliers reacted to perceived shortages without always knowing the true current demand. Long term impact. Eventually, this mismatch between supply and demand, driven by the bullwhip effect, can cause over or underproduction, price volatility, and food insecurity. For example, while some countries might have increased grain production due to the demand surge, they may not be able to meet the fluctuating global demand accurately, further compounding supply chain disruptions. The Russian Ukrainian war highlights the bullwhip effect in global grain supply where small disruptions at the origin, Ukraine's grain exports, lead to large, amplified fluctuations in supply chain orders, inventory, and prices as information traveled upstream through the supply chain. This resulted in inefficiencies, higher prices, and supply shortages. The ongoing war has shown the critical importance of supply chain resilience and the need for countries to prepare for unexpected disruptions. The Ukrainian crisis has forced many nations to reconsider their reliance on a few major suppliers for vital resources, like grain, and has highlighted the vulnerability of global supply chains in times of geopolitical instability. While Ukraine's efforts to address the challenges caused by the war are ongoing, the global grain supply chain will need continued innovation cooperation, and investment to ensure that the world can navigate the complexities of this crisis and minimize the impact on food security worldwide.